Between 1942 and 1944, more than 1,000 women flew military aircraft across the United States as members of the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP. They flew every type of aircraft the Army Air Forces operated: trainers, fighters, bombers. They ferried planes from factories to airfields. They towed targets for live anti-aircraft gunnery practice. They flew cargo, tested repaired aircraft to verify airworthiness, and ran instrument training flights. They did this for 38 months. When the program was disbanded in December 1944, they were told to go home. They were not given military status. They were not given veterans' benefits. The women who died in service were denied military honors. Their families paid for their funerals. It took 33 years for the record to be corrected. The WASP program began as two separate organizations. The first was the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, established in September 1942 by Nancy Harkness Love, with pilots already qualified to fly military aircraft. The second was the Women's Flying Training Detachment, established in November 1942 by Jacqueline Cochran, which trained women pilots from scratch. In August 1943, the two programs were merged into the Women Airforce Service Pilots under Cochran's direction, with Love continuing to lead the ferrying operations. The numbers are worth holding in mind. Approximately 25,000 women applied. Of these, 830 were accepted into training. 1,074 graduated and received their wings. They flew 60 million miles in service. They were qualified on 78 different types of military aircraft. 38 of them died in the line of duty. The work they did was not incidental to the war effort. It was structural. Before the WASP program, delivering aircraft from factories to operational airfields required pulling experienced male pilots from combat training or active service. By 1943, the Army Air Forces needed every qualified combat pilot it could put in the air over Europe and the Pacific. The WASP program solved this problem directly. Experienced, capable pilots who were not eligible for combat flew the ferry missions, freeing combat-qualified men for operational duty. They flew aircraft that were sometimes freshly manufactured and untested. They flew B-26 Marauders, a twin-engine medium bomber that had earned a reputation among pilots as difficult and unforgiving. The B-26 had a short wingspan relative to its weight, required more landing speed than most aircraft of its class, and was not forgiving of error. The death rate among male pilots training on the B-26 at Avon Park was high enough that male trainees were refusing to fly it. The Army Air Forces sent WASP pilots to fly demonstration missions at Avon Park in 1943, showing that the aircraft was flyable, not to minimize the aircraft's difficulty, but to demonstrate that the problem was in the training methodology, not in the machine. They also towed targets for live anti-aircraft artillery practice. This required flying at low altitude in a predictable pattern while ground crews fired live ammunition at a target sleeve towed behind the aircraft. The calibration margin between the target and the towing aircraft was not comfortable. The work required precision, composure, and the willingness to place the aircraft in a position where an error in range or bearing by someone on the ground would have direct consequences for the pilot. The WASP were not in combat. They were not eligible for the combat roles that carried military decorations and the formal recognition of valor. But the work they did was essential, continuous, and dangerous. 38 of them did not come home. When the WASP program was disbanded in December 1944, there had been proposals to militarize the program, to give the women formal military status, veterans benefits, and the protections that came with military service. The proposal failed in Congress. Opponents argued that militarizing the WASP would take positions from returning male pilots. The women were sent home without military status, without benefits, and without formal recognition. The 38 women who died in service were not given military funerals. The Army Air Forces was prohibited by the War Department from paying the cost of returning their remains home. Their fellow pilots often collected money among themselves to send the bodies home. American flags were not permitted to be placed on their coffins. Jacqueline Cochran spent years after the war working to have the WASP recognized. Nancy Harkness Love did the same. The women themselves, those who were still alive, organized, corresponded, testified before Congress. They asked for recognition not of valor in combat but of service rendered. Of the 38 who had died, of the record that existed and had simply not been formally acknowledged. In 1977, 33 years after the program ended, Congress granted the WASP veteran status. In 2009, the The surviving WASP were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. When the gold medal was presented, the surviving WASP who attended the ceremony were mostly in their 80s and 90s. They had, for 33 years, held the documentation of what they had done. They had the flight logs, the maintenance records, the training records, the accident reports. They had the names of the 38 who died. They had the facts of the 60 million miles and the 78 aircraft types and the towing missions and the B-26 demonstrations and the ferry routes and the instrument training flights. The record existed. It had always existed. It had simply not been officially acknowledged. In 2016, the remaining WASP were authorized to have their ashes interred at Arlington National Cemetery. This decision was reversed the following year. In 2021, Congress passed legislation permanently restoring Arlington eligibility for the WASP. The correction was incomplete and slow and interrupted. It took 79 years from the end of the program to arrive at a settled answer about whether these women would be honored where they had a right to be honored, the record of what they flew and where and how many miles, and the 38 who did not come home. That record was accurate on the day the program ended in December 1944. The 33-year gap between that record and its formal recognition was not a gap in the evidence. There is a photograph that does not exist because cameras were not always present and the work was not considered worth photographing at the time. The photograph would show a woman in an Army Air Force's flight suit climbing into the cockpit of a B-26 Marauder at an airfield in Florida in 1943, in the midday heat, to fly a demonstration that would convince a training program to stop refusing to fly a perfectly airworthy aircraft. She would be settling her flight helmet, checking her instruments, running through the pre-flight sequence in the particular methodical way that a pilot runs through it when the aircraft is unfamiliar and the conditions are not ideal. There is no photograph because nobody thought to take one. The flight happened. The record shows it. The outcome, male pilots returned to the B-26 training program and completed it, is documented. The woman who flew the demonstration mission does not have a name in the publicly available records because the records of individual WASP flight assignments are archived and not all of them have been fully processed. She flew. She came back. She went on to the next assignment. That is the record.